You probably know that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell was sounding off in Jackson Hole over the weekend. Pay little attention to what he says. The Federal Reserve is not some college of monetary cardinals. These people are not possessed of singular skills and surpassing virtues when it comes to the art and science of financial and economic management. Nor are they far above the fray of the coarse politics that attend to ordinary democracy. The real issue is that the Fed is no more essential to American prosperity than the tea tasters' board of the past. Still, it's one of the most base, arrogant, power-aggrandizing institutions ever to rise on the landscape of modern governance. Contrary to the myth of apoliticality, rather than the rambunctious partisanship of Democrat versus Republican, blue versus red. For the most part, the traditional politics of left and right is a relatively harmless indoor sport, and it's great for ratings. It's important to remember, though, that the Founding Fathers were sceptical of the state, if not downright hostile towards it. That's why they confected a federal machinery that slouched towards inertia and inaction. James Madison's genius was to create a forum for the demos to let off steam, not to build a colossus astride the liberty and enterprise of a free society. They sure as hell didn't anticipate the creation of an all-powerful central bank entirely outside the layers of checks and balances restraining other enumerated branches of checks and balances restraining other enumerated branches and institutions they made. The Fed embodies a shadow duopolistic dictatorship. It's run by an unelected, self-perpetuating elite. It's a monetary politburo. Dictatorships everywhere and always fail because they offend the natural rights and liberties of free people. They are also incompetent when it comes to the economy. That's the heart of the matter. That's what Trump, even for all his bile, bombast, braggadocio and bullshit, gets at a fundamental level. And it's what will make him the great disruptor. People never seem to ask the question as to why the Federal Reserve, or should I just say Wall Street? Interest rates are a function of economic growth. Globally, despite massive levels of QE and low interest rates, economic growth is faltering, not strengthening. The Fed knows and understands this perfectly well. Unfortunately, the Fed is still misdiagnosing what ails the economy, and this will continue to cause monetary policy to be unlikely to change the outcome in the US, just as it failed in Japan. The reason is simple. You can't cure a debt problem with more debt. Therefore, monetary interventions and government spending cannot and do not create organic, sustainable economic growth. Really, how hard is this to understand? There has never in history at any level been an example of more debt curing. Therefore, monetary interventions and government spending cannot and do not create organic, sustainable economic growth. Really, how hard is this to understand? There has never in history at any level been an example of more debt curing the problem of debt. Never. Yet, like according to the classic definition of madness, they go on doing more and more of what doesn't work, expecting a different result. Simply pulling forward future consumption through monetary policy continues to leave an ever-growing void in the future that must be filled. Eventually, the void will be too great to fill. If rates ever do rise, it's game over as borrowing costs surge, deficits balloon on further debt expansion just to sustain current growth. Lower rates are not the solution. They are the problem. So far, the outcomes are already bad. And now, because the outcomes are already bad, they're wanting to drive interest rates even lower to deal with the bad outcomes that these low interest rates have already caused. You know, if I were the CEO of Walmart, the most successful retail company ever in the world, I would be embarrassed if over 25% of my employees were on food stamps or government assistance. Especially if, as its CEO, I made $24 million a year. I spent $9 billion in stock buybacks and paid out $6 billion in dividends and paid out $6 billion in dividends and had $6 billion in profits. I also think Walmart sets the going salary wherever it's located. I bet if they raised the salary, others would have to follow in some manner. I'm all for the free market in wages, but you'd be surprised how many companies are gaming the 30 hours or less, which is considered part-time, in order to get out of paying health insurance. That just means everybody who's paying for health insurance is picking up the tab for those who get subsidized health insurance. Since it's been so long since a real recession hit the United States, I thought I'd give you an overview of what a real humdinger looks and feels like. The word recession really means. Well, I have seen one, and I am here to tell you that it's not pretty. Many people who have been lulled into a sense of security and complacency are going to have their worlds shattered. Many are even too young to have any idea of what even a mild recession feels like. There are aspects to the upcoming one which are different from the others that have preceded it, and I'm going to show you how and why. Judging by attitudes as expressed in the mainstream media, many people really do seem to think that the everything bubble can just keep on inflating forever. Let's have a look at what I mean by a profoundly shattering recession. This should be seen as a systemic, crushing, economic meltdown that can't be reversed with central bank magic. This is a recession that only deepens with time. The last real recession was roughly 2 generations ago in 1981, just as I was starting out in my own career. Younger generations have no experience of a profound recession, and perhaps older people have forgotten the shock, the angst and bitterness. A deeply shattering recession leaves tremendous damage and pain in its wake. Millions of people who reckoned their positions were secure get laid off, businesses that looked solid melt into air, large corporations flip from who reckoned their positions were secure get laid off, businesses that looked solid melt into air, large corporations flip from hiring thousands to firing thousands, and everyone on the edge of insolvency gets a hard push over the cliff. Deeply searing recessions feed on themselves in a self-reinforcing dynamic. The first domino could be a supply shock or a decline in demand due to credit exhaustion. Since businesses have cut everything to the bone in the past decade, there are no buffers left. Layoffs begin immediately, and those layoffs further reduce demand as households have to tighten belts to survive, as even those who escape the first round of layoffs find bonuses and overtime have been slashed. Since the rates, central banks reducing rates or pushing them into negative territory only reveals their impotence. If negative interest rates boosted the real economy, Europe and Japan would be experiencing rapid expansion instead of continued and worsening stagnation. Layoffs, together with the failure of central banks and soaring fiscal deficits, trigger a drop in consumer and investor sentiment, which feeds back into declining sales and profits, which then triggers more layoffs as businesses must cut expenses due to cratering revenues. Clearly, there is no benefit to households or enterprises to this self-reinforcing recession. The benefits are structural. Financialization, which is the parishes and local governments that have been insolvent in all but name, will finally go bankrupt, clearing the system of their dead weight. Economies supporting zombie entities are sacrificing their capital to keep insiders afloat, which leaves less capital to invest in increasing productivity. This is the only way to increase broad-based wealth. The everything bubble will finally pop, stripping the system of phantom speculative wealth and fictitious capital. Price discovery will once again be possible, as all the central bank inflated bubbles will deflate and real demand and supply will set the price of assets. Once central banks have been revealed as powerless, the quasi-religious belief in their omnipotence will dissipate. And people will finally start dealing with the Gilded Age excesses of the past 20 years. Common sense limits on financial predation and trickery will gather support, and tricks like corporate buybacks will be outlawed or restricted. If capital can't earn a low-risk return, it can't flow to productive uses. Once central bank manipulation fails, capital might demand a decent yield. In doing so, it will start a beneficial cycle in which speculation will no longer be enabled and rewarded by zero interest rates or negative rates. Only those enterprises and households with productive uses for borrowed capital will reckon the interest costs are worth the risk of taking on debt. Return to its proper role, a thin, regulated sector of the economy stripped of political power. All the cartels and monopolies that depend on debt will implode. Banking, higher education, national defense, sick care, all of which depend on federal borrowing to fund their predatory pricing. The US economy needs a reset if it is to lift all boats. Frankly, the sooner the reset occurs, the sooner we can dispense with all the cronyist intervention, self-serving manipulation and exploitative distortion that's turning the economy and society at large into a speculative casino that only benefits a few insiders and those who know how to rig the game in their favor. And exploitative distortion that's turning the economy and society at large into a speculative casino that only benefits a few insiders and those who know how to rig the game in their favor. Such a devastating recession requires patience, fortitude, and an awareness that the sacrifices demanded will be worth the pain if we rid our society of at least the top layer of financial and political parasites and predators that have corrupted the economy, governance, and society as a whole. It's really hard to believe that there are still people who think the everything bubble can just keep inflating forever. Surely nobody's that deluded. Have been selling stock at an average rate of $600 million per day during the month of August. This kind of wild selling indicates that there is a tremendous amount of fear among corporate insiders right now, and such selling would only make sense if a stock market crash is imminent. Corporate insiders have the rightful reputation for being the most prescient of all market operators, so it would be very foolish to ignore what they are doing. August is on track to be the 5th month of the year in which insider selling tops $10 billion. The only other times this has happened were 2006 and 2007, the period before the last bear market in stocks. Corporate insiders and Wall Street elite are feverishly was about to strike. But meanwhile, millions upon millions of hardcore conservatives feel completely relaxed because they feel like Trump has everything under control. At this moment, corporate insiders are dumping stocks as if the everything bubble was about to burst in a major way. If those corporate insiders are correct, millions upon millions of other Americans will be completely and utterly unprepared for what is about to happen.